Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Johanna Agerman Ross, and I'm the founder of the quarterly design journal Disegno. With me on stage, we have Staffan Tollgard, who's the proprietor and founder of Staffan Tollgard Design Group, looking after interior design and architecture schemes. And then we have Patrizia Moroso, head of Moroso, the Italian furniture manufacturer. Although both Patrizia and Staffan are very much preoccupied with contemporary design, we thought that it would be interesting and a nice moment to delve back into history and looking a little bit at the post-war origins of both Swedish and Italian design. Both of those design cultures, one could say, have developed into very strong design brands with very different and distinct design identities throughout the course of the 20th century. But how and what is that? What is that identity? That's a question that I hope that we can delve a little bit deeper into tonight with both of you two, Patrizia and Staffan. I thought maybe Patrizia, you now head up Moroso, an Italian design manufacturer, but it is very much has its roots in post-war Italian design. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the origins of Moroso and the history of the company.
What is my experience? Because, of course, there is a story. What happens in Italy, the terrible, bad war. My parents, like many other young people like them, you have to remember that they were really... She was 16 and my father was 20 when they started working together. So before that, they decided what to do of their lives. And was difficult to decide because everyone was going away. So when my mother said, let's go to Canada, for instance, he said, okay, maybe yes, but he didn't know what to do, and so he put the coin, tang, 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 and the coin decided, no, you have to stay. So he said, okay, we stay, but not working for someone else. We are young, but we will establish our thing. That was the beginning, 52. I was born a few years later, but I remember my playground was the table of my mother, under the table of my mother. You know, I was playing with fabrics, of course. It's my passion. And the atmosphere was beautiful because all these young people that represent Italy in that moment, you have to imagine Italy where the old people that was also making the war was destroyed, totally out of fed and these terrible things. So the young people that was not making the war before, very young, it was the only, how to say, part of the population that wanted to do things with a lot of energy because finally the bad things was finished and with a lot of effort. And the beginning was that, and the beginning was also instinctive. I don't know, they were not designers, they were not architects, of course, but my father was a fantastic drawing, fantastic in design things, and the first thing were designed by him. So, but soon later, in the 60s, for instance, he understood the importance to have someone, and these first things are funny, because they are looking all like American funny things, like a banana shape, or things like that, because of course, America was the winner, and they saved us. So the total, how to say, all the young people was dreaming that world. The American dream was coming. And before, in Italy, how to say, was not, the living room was not a real room for everyone. Was, for the rich people with the, come si dice, borghesi, bourgeois, okay, with the proper house. They had this and that and many living rooms, maybe the salotto bianco, salotto rosso, and so on. But not the normal people. Normal people had the kitchen and maybe a little sofa in the same room. And for the first time, houses start to have a proper room for the sofa. Why? Because there was another American thing, the TV. Sofas were a new big item and was a big demand because it was something that nobody had. And eventually they wanted, anyway, the new one in American style. Yeah, to feel very modern and to have the car with the like that, maybe pink or something like that. And so 60s arrived and was a little bit different with an Italian culture that was starting to be established and strong, and the architects based usually in Milano, that place, that is the center of the world of design in Italy, and but they started to be influenced, and they started to do things also important. And in the 60s and 70s, the design in Italy was very radical, for the same reason as before, because everyone wanted to change page, to turn, and so in that time, my father started to work with architects. That was the new person that was introduced in the company. The first architects, they were young architects of my city, but the other one, year 68, so important year, and it was a young boy that was making his military service just in the village after the company, and was very curious, because, you know, he was from Milano, but going to Milano for 2 days in the weekend was not possible. Long trains, no highway, it was impossible. And so he preferred to stay, and one day he entered in the company asking my father if I can have a look. I'm very interested in. He said, good boy, this has a good eyes, this boy has a good eye. His name is Antonio Citterio. So
I think we will continue that story a little bit later, because I think we're keen to also hear the continuation. But I think if we go back to you, Staffan, even if, of course, Patricia's story is very evocative of Italy at the time, I'm not sure if you can offer the same insight into Sweden in the 1950s. But
no, and actually the interesting thing is that post-war Italy is all about looking forward, and to explain post-war in Scandinavia, you need to look backwards, actually, because like you said, we weren't in the war, and yet, you know, our kind of the height of our design period was the 50s. So, you know, if the 60s and 70s belong to Italy, the 50s belong to us. And therefore, you need to explain what happened before. So we had, you know, ours was an evolution after the Second World War, and yours was a revolution. But we had a quiet revolution in a Swedish way, in the turn of the century, when there was a social conscience that started to kind of grow, and Sweden was very poor at the time, people were emigrating, and you had people, I guess, daring to speak out and say that there needs to be, there's this beautiful phrase, which is beauty for everyone.
By Ellen Key, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. She was a philosopher, and she had an agenda for sure. But it was starting to awaken this social conscience within design, and you know, this goes on because, you know, Sweden had 46 years of socialist government in a row, and on that you can really implement kind of theories, and designs emulate, I think, or mirror the society they're in. So you had a very fair society, and therefore you had a very fair view on design. You had a really interesting period in the 20s, which was called the Swedish Grace period, where it was a kind of Nordic neoclassicism where we stripped everything back. So we took the classical shapes and we pared it down, which Scandinavians always done, I think. And it's a very elegant, very beautiful, but very brief period of our design history, because 10 years later you had functionalism. In 25, Sweden went to Paris at the show and showed the most beautiful pavilion of this Nordic neoclassicism. And 5 years later, at the Stockholm Fair, it was all completely pared back and functionalism. But, you know, so this grows. 39 was the World Fair in New York. You had Sven Markelius working with Gunnar Asplund on doing a Swedish functionalism again, but it had evolved. So this is the whole evolution idea, where it was very democratic, it was very accessible, it wasn't elitist, it was for everyone. And then obviously the war happened, and we continued the evolution. So the 50s, and if you go and if you look at most of the designs that everyone kind of appreciates, a lot of them were designed in the 50s. And that's when Scandinavian, not just Swedish, but Scandinavian design exploded on the world stage. And there was a tour in America for about 3 years on Scandinavian design, and it, I think, has succeeded in kind of freezing Scandinavian design in time, and for better or worse, because it basically, if you say Scandinavian design, everyone pictures oak floors, white walls, design, mid-century design. If I say Italian design, there's so much to choose from, and that's one of the not problems, but it was so well defined, and it was so successful so quickly that it is what pretty much everyone remembers of Scandinavian design. But it continued through the 50s into the 60s, but copies came about and kind of diluted the whole thing. So I think we lost our way at just about the time when Italy was, you had the amazing Italian economy, which was just kind of booming, and it designed fast-looking, beautiful, interesting things, and we were, designing oak things that we'd woven, together. And I think it's only recently, maybe late 90s, maybe 20 years ago, when actually the mid-century design has become really interesting. Again, people buying, birth of first dibs and all that. So, people buying collectibles. It has injected, I think, a lot of energy back into the Scandinavian design industry, kind of living on the past, but now, I think finally, really doing some interesting things.
Let's go back to your story, because I'm very curious. You told us of the history of Moroso and how your father and your mother set up from a very small workshop and grew it into a very substantial and now global business. But globalism is very much actually down to you and your brother, I would say, Roberto, who took over in the 1990s properly from your father, who then retired. But what was your vision at that point? Because really what you've done with Moroso is you've taken it in some ways out of the Italian history. What made you have that idea, and what made you go down that route with Moroso when it was your time to steer the company?
I don't know. I'm going free. But my background was to be on the side of the artist. So what I love, especially of my love, is the relation with the person, the creative person. In the end, what I was dreaming to do, so to be a curator of art, is more or less what I'm doing, because I'm a curator of artists. For me, that they are fantastic people, that they choose to be designers instead of other things. My first experience as, let's say, art director, but in my family, they were saying, come on, what art director? You're the daughter, come on. Okay. What I did in the beginning is the sign, is the continuing story, is the fil rouge of what I'm doing now. So these three things, young, artist, and different culture. These are three important items for me, and I try to keep always in my story. You were saying how you choose. I don't know, but in any case, they are part of these three groups.
Yeah. And that's Moroso as we now know it, of course. So that's very interesting to hear how that all came about. Staffan, on your end, you obviously have developed a business here in London, but you are Swedish. I'm curious to see that the way that you show your showroom here, for example, is not really playing up to your Scandinavian or Swedish roots. It's a much more eclectic assembly of objects. So how come you decided to sort of not go for the
obvious?
Yeah.
It's because I've lived outside of Sweden more than I've lived in Sweden. I've been in England for 24 years. And I think, and specifically in London, which I think is the best multicultural city in the world. So I think, there's a Swedish approach to what we do in the studio, and it's this, which I just discovered is quite a popular word at the moment. I've always used it, but I've never heard it before, which is lagom. And lagom I've been fascinated by because it's one word in Swedish, and you cannot say it in one word in English. But this approach, which is not too much, not too little, this very democratic Scandinavian thought. And I think we approach our projects in that way, where we work in high end, but we're not shiny, we call it in our studio. We're not bling. We're not. We use fantastic furniture from all over the world, and we design all over the world. So we kind of have to be prepared to be eclectic. Our approach is Scandinavian in its lagom. And I think also in its approach about the home. I think home is very important to Scandinavians. I don't know if it's the dark nights in the winter or if it's what it is, but being house proud. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, we never went out. We entertained. People would come, family would come, friends would come, and you would cook up a storm at home, and home was hugely important. So I think we do a lot of residential design, so I think the approach to home and how important it is for the families that we design for is quite a Scandinavian way. When you were talking about how you choose designers, and there's this... the Italians kind of invented the rock star designer, the proper, the architect that steps forward and says, this is how we're to do it. Whereas all of Scandinavia is completely different. There's very little, until recently I would say, there's very little ego. There's, I think Monique and I was talking about this talk over the last few days, and she said something interesting. She said that Swedish design or Scandinavian design is more about the question than the answer. And I think that's completely true. It's so based in this, not all positive, by the way, very democratic view of that everyone should be able to do everything, and everyone should be able to afford and achieve everything. That there's this kind of political, social conscience about it. So that's not very rock star, is it? So, there's a reason why you have Ferrari and we have Volvo. So I think there was a long time this almost, it was weighing down Scandinavian designers from the mid-century onwards, because that's how you had to behave and had to be. You're meant to think those things. And I think now you've got, in the last 20 years, you've got really interesting Scandinavian designers coming out with some crazy ideas. Front, who designs for you, I think, are definitely a group. But yet you still have, if you go to the fairs today, you have new companies, but that are in a beautiful way still designing democratic furniture for the masses, and very accessible in terms of design and price. So
it's been a very strong legacy, indeed. Yeah,
may I add a little thing? It's an experience around 20 years ago when I started working with Patrizia Moroso. One of our first things, because we both was loving Scandinavia, of course, is the starting point of design in Europe. And so we went there more than once. But the first time, we went together to make a trip 20 years ago. You have to remember that. And we were so surprised because we didn't see a big something. So the past, the beautiful past, you have had, the golden age of design, probably the unique in Europe. And then you pass this this thing to the modernism in America, but before you was the Golden Age, and for us the starting point. But with the problem that many times the Golden Age, the Renaissance, and makes so too beautiful to have children, too strong, too unique, and so no children. It was a sort of terrible stop, because the beauty that you reach in that years was sublime, of course. So in this trip, me and Patrizia was talking about that. But come on, in every place you go, you have a beautiful Jacobsen piece and another. Everything was related with absolutely with the past, and so we said, okay. And she said, I got an idea. I want to break this beauty. I want to break this symmetry, the beautiful symmetry of these objects. So we came back, and she, really in 1 week, she sent me that design, Fjord. Fjord has that name because it's the memory of the trip together, and we were going, all along the countries in the fjords, beautiful. But she said, okay, I want to break a swan, for instance, the most beautiful piece, to break it and put on the sand on the beach and see what happens with the wind and the sun and the water, and that like a shell that in the beginning is perfect and is a perfect object and entire, and then it breaks, and maybe after a while it could be another beautiful thing, another beauty, the beauty of imperfection, the beauty of a broken object, and the beauty of a contemporary world, because we are no more living in a golden age, I think, for a lot of time, and we are living in a broken world with a lot of damage, and so you have to show the damage done, and that is an important piece, because when it came out, it was just a new armchair, but it was like breaking something, and everyone was immediately talking about that object. What is that asymmetry? Nobody knows, but this object for me maintains the memory of the beauty of the past, and as the new beauty that comes out from the broken thing, and your eyes, your mind, have to find a new equilibrium, a new harmony in what is not more perfect but is broken. And I think that we have to find this harmony in our world, because our world is not perfect.
You've been listening to a Disegno podcast. For more podcasts, visit disegnodaily.com.